Welcome to Crossroads. This is a casual conversation with pastors and friends exploring the intersection and particularly the confrontation of our faith as Christians with the culture of this world. We're so glad that you can join us. I'm Michael John, the pastor of the Market Street Baptist Church here in Amesbury. And joining me today, as always, to my left is Rick Harrington, pastor of First Baptist in Haverhill, and Dave Hammer, pastor of Danville Baptist Church. Thank you for coming back, men.
Good to see you, Michael.
Good to be here.
And let's get into it. Last time we did a brief overview of what we call the Progressive Creed. I have it right here in my hands. And that we've been seeing posted all over the place on churches, businesses, and front lawns. And as a reminder, it says, this was from a church in this congregation. We believe that love is love, Black Lives Matter, climate change is real, no human being is illegal, all genders are whole, holy and good, and women have agency over their bodies. And last time we were together, we broke it down and we took briefly touched on each of those 6 points and how that creed, though it is inspiring to many in this world, we have some issues with it and we need to address some of the differences. This week we're going to start taking a closer look at each of those lines, and today's topic is that first line, love is love. Now, as we discuss this line and every line thereafter, reminder that with everything, our aim is to gain a biblical understanding of the world and of our culture. And our personal opinions don't really matter much, but we are striving to be men of the book. That's what we've studied and devoted ourselves to, and we hope that we will help Christians and believers all over the place to have a deeper appreciation for what the scriptures teach. So the first question is this. It seems like a no-brainer, that love is love. And my question would be, well, what else, of course, would it be? You know, a rose is a rose is a rose. And we learned this in mathematics, the reflexive property, that A equals A. It's not particularly interesting. But I don't think that's what this is about. This isn't about grammar. This isn't about just making an obvious statement here. So I'm going to start with you, Rick. What does this congregation mean when they say we believe that love is love? What does that mean?
Well, I think, again, languages can be somewhat slippery, but I think the idea, if I understand it correctly, is that all forms of love, heterosexual, sexual, or homosexual, are equally valid, equally good, and to be recognized and treasured. So a marriage between a man and a woman, a marriage between a man and a man, a marriage between a woman and a woman, love is love. In all situations, there are two people who love each other, and therefore it should be valued, accepted, recognized.
Yeah. Do you want to add more to that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we mentioned on the last show is that each of these is a political slogan designed to gain instant affirmation by any person. So anyone would say, yeah, I mean, if two people love each other, then two people love each other. I mean, if people are kind to each other and look out for each other, great. We agree with that. But then when you dig under the covers, what I think love is love means, as Rick was saying, is a man loving a woman is just as good as a man loving a man or a woman loving a woman.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's more to it than meets the eye.
So this is really about the normalization
Yes.
of homosexuality and homosexual relationships, and maybe the redefinition of marriage.
Yes. Yeah.
And this was a big fight that we had back in early 2000s, if I remember. I think it began here in Massachusetts, did it not? With the Supreme Court, basically just making the statement that homosexual marriage is a thing and it's legitimate. And when it got to the Supreme Court, Anthony Kennedy even went so far as to say that to oppose this, really, the only motivation he could possibly think of was that you're bigoted in some way.
Yeah.
So back in the day, years ago, it was I believe, if I'm not mistaken, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. Was it some kind of it was on the spectrum of behaviors that were not normal, that were outside the bounds.
Yeah.
But now it is the case, and it seems like they have some points to it. They have some interesting points, because you can say that homosexual people, one of the phrases that you'll hear again is they're born that way. They can't help this. So how do you, what do they mean by that? They're born that way.
Sure. So just as I am born, most, I think you could say most men would be born with a propensity, a sexual desire for the opposite sex, that some are born with those same type of desires, but for the same sex, both men and women.
Yeah.
So if you're born that way, isn't that a justification to live out with that expression with someone of the same sex?
So God made me this way. God made me with these desires and inclinations, and it seems awfully cruel to then deny me the opportunity to express that, these things that fulfill me. You're fulfilled. You have happy marriages. I have a happy marriage, and well, how could we deny that happiness to a person who doesn't have those same inclinations?
I mean, on the side of what Justice Kennedy was saying, I think it's probably true that a lot of anti-homosexual sentiment in the past was what he would call, and others, homophobic. So it was only or primarily, it was a lot of that's gross, those people are gross, those people that do that, they're demented or some other thing like that. And I think if I could say one good thing that's come of, as our culture has changed in the recent decades, is a recognition that just because someone has certain sexual attractions to the same gender doesn't mean that they're in some way either less human or gross or anything like that. That they're definitively people like me and you. That they're and in fact they in a lot of ways will likely be more moral. They may be more intelligent than me, and so forth. So I am happy about that. The reduction in what would be called homophobia.
And it was a lot of it. I remember back in the 80s, it was, it was hard. I mean, I remember that time of just how cruel you could be. And I remember even in college as a youth leader, and how easy it was to make fun of people who were homosexuals. And it was the last thing on earth that a man particularly would ever want to be mistaken for. And it was easy to mock and ridicule. And I remember there was a young man who was in our youth group, and we never thought for a minute anything was going on, but he was struggling with homosexuality. And he never shared that. And why would he, when we would laugh and mock people who were homosexuals? And look back at that was a great regret to see, and how he went full into that movement and became quite a vigilant activist on the other side of things, and became very bitter toward the church. And part of me is like, I can understand that, and they have legitimate gripes that we certainly can address. They when they got into marriage, and I remember the argument against marriage, against homosexual marriage, that was commonly being used was every child needs a mother and a father. That never seemed particularly strong to me. I don't know if you guys felt about that, what would be the response of those who were calling for homosexual marriage against that? That was sort of the standard take, was, we're against homosexual marriage because every child needs a mother and a father. But it seems to be fairly easy to knock that down. What would you say to that if you were defending homosexual marriage?
If I was defending
If you were defending it,
Yeah, I mean, that there are plenty of families where there's a single parent at home, and those are difficult situations, but good kids are raised in there, and having two parents at home would be an improvement on that. Right? So I think it would simply recognizing that families are definitely unique and different throughout the country, and so to assume that every family has to have, that would be an expectation that isn't true of a lot of broken families around.
Dave, as a pastor, when this came about, were you serving as a pastor at this time? I don't remember you.
When the law was passed in
Yeah.
Supreme Court, I've been in ministry for.
How did you, did you feel any engagement with this as a pastor? Did you engage with this topic at all? It was a challenging one for us. I think it was a little different than other ones. How did you engage it?
I really hadn't. I mean, this might be one of the first times this setting right now when I've spoken about it.
Yeah.
So.
'Cause I remember the time one thing we had talked about before we began here of kind of our approach to things. I remember at the time I did not feel as ravenously mad about this issue as other ones. I felt like my fury was really that the Supreme Court was taking over and mandating things and not giving a voice to the people and letting them decide. But for me, it was like the passage in 1 Corinthians 5 where it says, what business is it of mine to judge the world? God, as far as the sexually immoral particularly, but it's God's business to judge the world, but ours is concerned for the church. And I think that's where we want to go. So on the one hand, I think we were all kind of in agreement that as a legal issue, there's a lot of takes we can have on this as Christians, whether it should be legalized or not. There's a lot of arguments we can make. But we're not about legal issues right now. We're really about moral issues, about things as Christians and how we deal with things as Christians and how the church addresses these things. So that's what I want to get into today. So we want to take a look at this question of love from the Scriptures and what is a biblical view of the three things we're going to look at is love, sex, and marriage. And what's a biblical take on that. So we're going to start with love. And Dave, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah.
I want to come up with a working definition of what love really is. We throw that word around so easily and so carelessly. Here's a couple scriptures that speak of love that I think we can begin with, and I want you to comment on them and then maybe help start this discussion of what is love according to the scriptures. John 15:12-13, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." And then 1 Corinthians 13:4-7 says, "Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth." That's 1 Corinthians 13:4-6. So help us understand this, Dave. What would you say is a definition of true biblical love?
Okay. Before I give a definition, I just want to acknowledge we're shifting. We're looking at love is love, and we're acknowledging that is primarily talking about romance. And now we're looking at what does the Bible say love is, which uses the same word, and they overlap a little, but it's not exactly. It's more than just romance. So from those scriptures, I'd say the Bible says that love is caring for the good of another, even to the point of being sacrificially caring for the good of another person. And love is at the center of Christianity. So the Bible tells us that God is love. The Bible tells us that right in that 1 Corinthians 13 passage, right before where you'd read, it says that if we don't have love, no matter what we have going for us, giftedness, sacrifices, whatever, if we don't have love, we're nothing. So the Bible puts love is the greatest priority for us as Christians, and it's sacrificial giving and service of others. Yeah.
Okay. You want to flesh that a little bit more?
Oh,
for
sure,
us?
yeah. So along with Dave, it's the highest virtue of the Christian faith. In fact, Jesus said the summary of the law is to love God with all your heart and soul, mind and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. So all the commandments of the law, think of the 10 Commandments, but even so many of the other commandments in the Torah are summarized by that commandment to truly love God and to love each other. I mean, in the Christian faith, it is, as you said, God is love. It's a defining characteristic of who He is, and it is what we are certainly called to do, and to love within the church, love each other as brothers and sisters, love those around us, love even our enemies. So to respond to ridicule, insult, even attack with love. So yeah, absolutely, it's the highest virtue of the Christian faith.
And the whole thing that God is love, and that love sums up all the commandments, and I think the greatest of these, of course, is love. So there's a sense in that love is, when truly defined this way, it is always virtuous. It is always good, always beautiful.
Yeah.
It is, because it's truly, this is the character of God, and we are aspiring to constantly growing, that our love would abound more and more. However, we would say, in a sense, I would say, I don't think I agree with this, love is love. I think not all love is love. That there are some
it's romantic love.
loves that are not necessarily love.
Okay.
And so, we talk about different kinds of loves.
Yeah.
And there's some loves that are maybe not love. So
Absolutely.
let's talk about some other kinds of loves. So
Maybe I'll start with some personal confession. Before I got married, and I'm heterosexual, but I would say that the romantic love that I was involved in before I was married, especially high school and college years, where a lot of alcohol, there were some drugs involved, and I had genuine, romantic attraction to women, and yet the Bible would say that romantic attraction was inappropriately expressed and engaged in by me.
So you loved, or that we could say that there are many men who love women, but don't really love women.
Oh.
Their love, in the sense of the romantic, it's one
That's
of
true.
desire. And when you look at this, of how often do we see a man infatuated with a woman and who is insisting on his own way and becoming jealous and boastful and arrogant and resentful and not patient and kind, and yet insisting that he loves. I remember, I think OJ insisted that he loved Nicole, insisted that, and that his love was so intense, it turns to violence. I think he's not understanding what love is, but I want you to add a little bit more to that, the different kinds of love and distinction of, what do you make of that phrase that not all love is love?
Well, I think that English word love, we put a lot on it, put a lot of weight on that word to try to make it mean a lot of different things. We love things. We love people. We love our family. We love our friends. We love our spouses. And we're kind of saying different things, right? Even in terms of make love, has a certain definition that may be very, very different than, obviously, it should be very different than when we think about a love for a friend or love for a family member or something. So the Greeks did have different words that they used in context as kind of the ultimate deciding factor, but eros kind of defined that romantic or sexual love, so which you get the English word erotic from it. And within a marriage covenant, there's a great place for eros, and there's it's a good thing. It can be used wrongly, but agape is the word that's used more often to refer to the love for God, or God's love for us, and the love that we're called to have for everyone, for our neighbor, and particularly for our brothers and sisters in the church, and even for our enemies, to have that agape love, which is that committed, self-sacrificial affection. It's not without affection, it's not without emotion, but it doesn't necessarily have any sexual connotations to it. In fact, usually it doesn't. Right? So,
I think as we're going through this, is the more I've been reading this, the more offended I am by this statement that love is love. That a church would take the word love and just equate it with a sexual relationship is so offensive, and so, because it's so contrary to the love that we see of Christ laying down his life and sacrificing. And the point here is that no, love is about satisfying myself and not laying down my life and not losing my life and for the good of another person. It's about finding fulfillment in myself. It's a self-centered. And so, to the point where our culture is so depraved that we sing songs of the greatest love of all. If you remember that inspiring song. I remember at my graduation, when our salutatorian had quoted that as a line of great inspiration that we all loved, that the greatest love of all, of course, is learning to love myself. To which I'm like, that's the worst love of all. That is not love at all. That is our natural state. We all love ourselves, and our challenge is to love other people. So, all right, it's a great start, and I think we want to keep that definition in mind as we go forward here. But let's talk about sex. Now, there are clear commands in the scriptures that Christians are to abstain from all forms of sexual immorality. But before we can abstain from what is immoral, we need to know what is moral. What is the proper use of things? So sex, we all agree that, and the scriptures are very clear that sex is a gift from God, and it has a proper use in a proper context. That which is outside of its proper use, we would say, is in that out of bounds, is in that category of immoral. Some may be way out of bounds, some may be just out of bounds, but it's still, there's boundaries and context for it. So I might say, like this pen, it has been given to me and designed specifically for writing to accurately transfer small amounts of ink to paper. That's what its purpose is, and when I do that, properly use it, it works brilliantly and can be a great blessing to me and to many people. It is not designed for me to paint my living room. That becomes not only a difficult thing, but a hassle, or to wash my dishes. These are things outside of its bounds, and it makes life more difficult and miserable when you use it out of bounds. So let's talk about the proper use of sex. Coming back to you, Rick, here, what is the biblical context and parameters for a sexual relationship? Where is it properly used?
Let me just stop and say, too, to emphasize what you said, Michael, that sex is a good thing that God has created. It's not an evil, so I know that. I think there have been times maybe in church history where it was almost frowned upon as always a negative, but God's actually the author, the creator of it, right from the beginning. Be fruitful and multiply. It's his intention for his creatures to use as one of his gifts, so for sure. But of course, like anything, like the pen, it can be used wrongly, it can be used in the wrong context, and it can be dangerous and destructive in different ways. So the context that God gives it is that loving, committed relationship between a man and a woman that we call marriage, covenant relationship. So it's not just two people coming together and saying, hey, let's just commit to one another, but sort of contractual, covenantal commitment, a to death do us part kind of commitment. And within that bounds, that's where sex flourishes within that realm.
So the first proper use of sex, it is within the covenant of marriage, and they use that phrase to consummate a marriage. Now, Dave, what does that mean?
I don't know. I'm not sure what you're getting at there.
So
I'll let you.
Oh, yeah. So consummating a covenant. So in any marriage and weddings that we do, we have that phrase at the end. If you may now kiss the bride, and sort of that was a token for polite society that you're going to finish the job tonight at some point. But that marriage was not legitimate until it had been consummated, until they engaged in a sexual relationship. And in the old days, they would have tents set up where the bride and groom would go, and everyone would wait for them to finish consummated marriage, and then they would celebrate after that, I suppose. But there was something about that it seals the covenant in a sense. It kind of finishes it and seals it. And until that is done, we even have that rule today, I think, that if you have not consummated the marriage, it's not a legitimate marriage.
It can be annulled.
Yeah,
if there is a
annulled. Yeah.
in some cases.
Yeah. So that's the first thing, and I think that's where we get into the Genesis 2 about the man leaves his father and mother, is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. There's that one fleshness. Give me another proper use of sex here in relationship. We mentioned about the context of marriage. Anything else we
So
can
you think
add to
about
that?
the purposes for which God gave it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. How else is it properly used?
In marriage, it's a display, and it's actually an acting out, a dramatization that the man and the woman give themselves unreservedly to each other for life. It's a way to say, I am yours for the rest of my life. And in doing that, it also has the potential of creating new life. And I'd add to that, it also energizes and reconnects and increases the emotional connection bond between two people. So all of these things are in play, and because so much is so powerful, those are reasons why It's not good when it's used outside of a lifelong commitment of a man and a woman.
Yeah, so as Christians, we would say that sex is to be an expression of love. What we've talked about love as this sacrificial giving to another person. How would you describe how does sex become an expression of true biblical love then in the context of marriage? And maybe how that contrasts to how it can be in a biblical marriage and not be an expression of love. Maybe if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think that any married couple, because there's a commitment surrounding that act, there is love and service. It's not self-serving merely. It's not just about what do I get out of this relationship. It is how do I please the other person, and that there's a mutual sort of enjoyment together.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, there's a recognition that it often produces children. It procreates. This brings new life into this world.
Life into this world.
Yeah.
So as an expression of love, the husband, if he loves his wife, his aim in the sexual relationship is to bring her joy and pleasure, and the wife's aim in this is to bring her husband joy and pleasure. It is not about, the husband is not just seeking release and satisfaction. His aim is to please in that, even if it doesn't work out so well for him. Yet he is aiming to please. That's where the sacrificing for the good of another comes in. I think that's really important. I think that's oftentimes why, as Christians, I think we can't be satisfied with saying that, if you're married, then, everything's fine in the bedroom, don't worry about it. But I think we're commanded at all times to love one another. And that's why there are other things said in the scriptures about sex, such as, not withholding from one another, that the wife's body does not belong to her, but to her husband, and the husband's body belongs to his wife. There's more to be said about this that we can explore in personal counseling sessions, but not here. We won't do that. So here's, while love is love and sex is sex, not all sex is love, not all love is love, as we see. And so I want to have you have a little back and forth here, why, as we understand these things. So some sex, we would say, like everyone knows, is illegal. It's pure hatred, like rape and such, and incest and these kind of horrible things. Some sex is just pure selfishness, prostitution, pornography we would put in there too. But what about other forms? And where might they go wrong? Why are these out of bounds? Why are these considered immoral for the Christian? Let's start with adultery. Adultery, or even what is now becoming more popular, polyamory, right? Having multiple partners or in an open relationship. And it's all consenting. We're not talking about betrayal and sneaking around. We're talking about like Will Smith, who's boasts about that he and his wife have this open marriage. And so how can that be wrong? Everyone's consenting, they're feeling good, everyone's having fun.
And that's a great question, I think, and one way to put it that I think, a flippant way that someone from our culture might put it is, why does God care who I sleep with? Or why does God care what I do in my bedroom?
Yeah.
And I think one way to talk about that and address those specific things you mentioned is that God cares because he cares about us, and he loves us. He loves every person individually, and he wants our life to go well. And so he knows the power of sexuality, whether it's to attach people or to produce kids, or the potential shame and hurt that can come from when things don't go well, which happens even when people want things to go well. Shame and disappointment can come. So in the case of let's just say polyamory. So one reason that God prescribes marriage between a man and a woman is that he wants it to be a display of his love for his people. So often marriage is talked about as, he talks about marriage as as a metaphor for his relationship with his people, and that Jesus is the groom and the church, his people, are the bride, and he wants it to display their undivided commitment to each other. For them to be a pure groom and a pure bride, like Jesus would never betray the trust or sleep around with other, with anyone else other than the people that he's committed to loving sacrificially. And he wants us to be like that with him. And he wants that displayed in our bedrooms.
Yeah. Yeah. I want you to add a little bit more to that, Rick, about this kind of openness in a marriage of why is that wrong?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's fair to say is polyamory is kind of rare. So usually adultery, which almost always involves betrayal, deceit, and a bunch of other things, and it's sort of a fundamental betrayal of the commitment of marriage, right? But in polyamory, you're sort of openly doing that. And I just think we talked about what is allowable, legal. Certainly, those things are all in that category. But what is right in God's eyes and what is pleasing to Him? I just think you're playing with an extraordinarily dangerous weapon. I think you're destroying the trust and the commitment and the love within that marriage anyway, even if it's an agreed upon sort of type of situation. I can't imagine that being healthy or good for that relationship. But again, I think that's pretty rare. Adultery is far more common, and it usually does involve betrayal as well.
Now, what about polygamy? What about I take mission trips to Swaziland, and the king there has like 14 wives at least, probably more now. And I get that question asked from the pastors over there, like, what do we say about polygamy? Because it's so commonly practiced over there. And you can say it's biblical. I mean, didn't David, a man after God's own heart, have multiple wives? Solomon, wisest man that ever lived, had 1,000.
One of the things you see in the Bible is when there is polyamory, it always goes badly. It goes badly in every single case, whether it's jealousy between the wives or jealousy between the children or favoritism. I mean, all sorts of emotional and relational dysfunction arises in every case. Maybe there's some polyamorous couples watching with pristine families, but I would assume that's not would be uncommon.
Yeah. So there seems to be it's a betrayal of the intimacy of it's designed for two becoming one, and there's that intimacy that we talked about. I think you open it up, you lose that. That's gone. And we're out of bounds now. Let's talk about something extremely common, and that is sex before marriage, of living together, and what the scriptures will often just sum up as fornication. Almost every couple that comes to me seeking to get married is already living together. It is so normal. It is so, and they don't think it's strange at all. It's a long way that we've come from our parents' generation here. But how do you explain? I mean, they're in a committed relationship. They're exclusive. They love each other. It's just a piece of paper, right? Start us off.
Yeah.
Why is that a problem?
Well, I think you say it's just a piece of paper, and it isn't the piece of paper that defines marriage. There's a lot more to it. It's a vow, a commitment before God, first and foremost, for Christians, before your church family, for your friends, before your actual family, that you are now stating this is the one, and we're in covenant relationship. So if you don't have that, you may feel a certain level of deep affection and even commitment, but there isn't actually that covenant, because there's something spiritual about marriage as well. It isn't just merely a contract that human beings came up with. There's something that God Himself intended for that sort of male-female complementation that comes together in a committed covenantal relationship. So without that, again, not only are you playing with fire, but I think you are acting outside the bounds of what God has intended for marriage. And there are always consequences to act against what God has intended for His people. So
there's a kind of a stereotype that Christians are anti-sex. But actually, I would say that Christians have a much higher view and more mystical view of sex than people who are not Christians. I think the prevalence of, say the hookup culture or cohabitation comes from thinking that the sex drive is like another appetite. It's like eating. It's just a bodily function, and we'd say that actually, in your emotional life, you can see that's not true. That you don't have the hamburgers you eat or the lunches you eat don't have the power to haunt you for decades to come. But people that have sexual experiences that don't even have to be that significantly bad. I'm not even talking about the worst cases of abuse, but you're going to remember even romantic flings for many years and probably decades. They're going to impact actually the kind of person you are, the kind of person, the way you relate to people, your ability to trust, and that fits with our understanding of the human body and human sexuality that we get from the Bible.
And just thinking pastorally, because you brought it up pastorally, because we live in a very sort of promiscuous culture, most people are going to have a background like you're describing there, Dave, and there's grace, there's mercy, there's forgiveness.
Absolutely.
And so that couple that comes to you and says, Pastor Michael, we want to get married, but we're living together. So they're seeking to move in the right direction. And so I would just say, thank God for that.
That's a good thing.
There are a couple that are committed and saying we want to make that final commitment and actually get married in the eyes of God, in the eyes of God's people, and so forth.
Yeah. So there's, when you have a covenant, is such a powerful thing. It's binding, it's public, and there are many benefits to it, and you are wanting all the blessings of the covenant, the joys of the covenant, without the real commitment of it. And it's that we use that phrase sometimes. You're playing house. It's a lot of pretend. You want to have all the benefits of being a husband and wife without actually having the commitment of that. And it's great. All right, we want to get to marriage now, because now we come back to the topic of homosexuality and homosexual marriage, because this question is, all right, fine, I get that sex is designed to be between two people to show intimacy in the covenant of marriage. Well, now guess what? Homosexuals can enter into the covenant of marriage. Why is that a problem for the church here? Let's talk about marriage and how God defines marriage as the covenant between one man and one woman intended for life. So Genesis 2 speaks about that. Before he institutes anything else, he says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two, not more than that, become one flesh. So it's a man and a woman, the two becoming one flesh, and that's what marriage is defined by God himself. It's not a social construct. Jesus reaffirms that too when speaking about divorce. He reaffirms Genesis 2. Paul also references it as well. It is very clearly defined in the scriptures. My question for us is this, and we'll start, Dave, with you. Why is marriage such a big deal for us as Christians? Why do we even care about this institution at all? And I want you to reflect upon that with us here.
Man, I suppose for one thing, it's because of what I said earlier, that it's meant to reflect God's relationship and Jesus' relationship with the church. Another way to answer it is because the health of marriages, or lack of it, will be most acutely felt by the weakest. So when marriages don't go well, it's bad. It's really bad for little babies. It's really bad for women, and especially poor women. And so if we care about the weakest, if we care about the well-being of those who are vulnerable, we're going to care about the health of marriages.
Dave mentioned that it reflects the relationship of Christ to the church. Paul makes that point. He says this is a mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. How does marriage reflect the relationship of Christ and the church?
It's a great question, and Dave did a great job explaining it. You see that right from the beginning, where Israel, God's people in Old Testament Israel, are described as the wife of God, that he is the husband who loves and he cares for and even is willing to serve and forgive and to be committed to. And Israel is at times described as an unfaithful wife even, committing spiritual adultery by going to worship the other nations, and yet God never gives up on his bride, and that ongoing sort of committed relationship. And then when Jesus comes, he describes himself, or he's described in the New Testament as the bridegroom, the groom of the church, the ongoing sort of relationship with God and his people. And so when marriage is described as in Ephesians 5, it says it's sort of a parable, like a living parable of the gospel, as a husband loves his wife as Christ loved the church, willing to die for her, willing to serve her, willing to give up his own sort of rights and privileges to help her. And the wife submits to the husband as in the way that the church submits to Christ, and that sort of interplay of love in complementation reflects something about God and his love for his bride.
So, go ahead.
I wanted to add, you used the word, a different version of it, I'll use complementarity. So in marriage, there's a complementarity, like there's a complementarity between God and people. We're created in God's image, but we're not God. We're like, but we're also unlike. And that's another thing that's reflected in marriage, that a man and a woman are both human beings created in the image of God, and yet they're not equivalent. We're different kinds of human beings. And when we come together as one, we reflect the kind of relationship that we're meant to have with God, different and yet united. And that doesn't happen in a homosexual relationship, because they are both, they're the same, they're not complementary. They don't have that difference. And so that fails to reflect that relationship between God and the church.
That's an interesting point. And there's something that is very uninspiring about a homosexual marriage, in that you have two people who are the same. Even when they get married, they dress the same, for goodness sake, usually, oftentimes. There's no mystery to it when you have two things that are alike coming together. Whereas the wonder is that a man and a woman are so different in every way. And that's something that even in this corrupt generation that we're in, where they're trying to blur those differences, you can't help but see it. It's everywhere, not just in the way that we look, but in the way that we think. Everything about us is so different, and the wonder and mystery of two people so different from one another becoming one it takes a lifetime to really figure that out. Whereas there's a certain, I don't know if it's a good word, laziness about the homosexual relationship. It's just like there's nothing to figure out. I get you. I'm one of you. It's like, it's as inspiring as when I had roommates in college. It's like, we're just a bunch of guys. And the funny thing is, you don't change when you're living with just guys, because we're all the same. So coming back to that, there's also another passage that I want to reflect upon a little bit too, and that is in Genesis 1, it speaks about how God made us in his image, and he made us male and female, and then gives the command to be fruitful and multiply. And it seems to me that marriage reflects the very nature of God himself. It reflects the image of God. Not just the man, but the man and the woman together reflecting the image of God. How does that work? How does marriage reflect the nature of God himself? That's my question. I'll give it to either of you to stab at that one here.
Well, I'll go ahead. I think it connects with what I was saying before, that within the Trinity, there's three who are the same in divinity, and yet they're not identical. There's a Father and a Son and a Holy Spirit. And and so three in one. And so in a similar way, we're not the same. Marriage is not for people that are the same, two women or two men. It's for people who are distinct and yet have the common humanity. So in that way, there's a similarity there.
Yeah, and we talked about this in the very beginning, that love necessitates another, right? Otherwise, you're just loving yourself, which is not a great expression of love. So in the very being of God, there are three persons, meaning there is love. There's eternal love. That God doesn't create us out of some need to be loved or to love something. He creates us out of really the overflow of His mercy. But there's already perfect love within God and His triune nature. And that when He creates human beings, He creates us communal as well. That we experience love for one another, which is the only way to be self-sacrificial. There has to be another. Which is, there's something beautiful about that, and again, that marriage relationship of saying, how do I put another person's need before my own within the context of covenantal commitment?
Yeah.
So.
Our understanding of the Trinity is so important with all of this. I think it's the only understanding of God that captures what everyone knows to be true. There's something wonderfully inspiring about love. Everyone understands that. Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, they all get it, that there's something wonderfully profound and beautiful about that kind of love for another person. But I think only the Trinity captures it in the Godhead. There's no other understanding of God that captures perfect love like that the Father has eternally loves the Son and does all things for the Son, gives all things to the Son. And even, just if I could come back to the sex thing too, we talk about sex used for conception, and we call that procreation, that we're procreating, as sort of a little mini creation, going back to the way that God creates the world. We hear, it's the Father, we're told, who creates all things through the Son.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, my son comes to me through my wife. That's how it works. So the Father creates through the Son, everything through the Son, and that seems to be kind of how a family, new human beings are born. It's not one person that can produce a child. It's two, one through the other.
And in that gender complementarity between male and female is something that, as Christians, we'd call, there's something about there's some natural revelation in that. So that I think the reason why a man-woman marriage, a man-woman union has been the norm in every culture throughout history, comes out of the fact that every culture has been able to perceive, even without special revelation, even without Genesis and the Bible, that men and women go together and they produce children together, and that they each have one half of the human reproductive system. And therefore, that's how sex is made to be used.
That's great. That's great. And as a living, breathing analogy to help us understand who God is and of our salvation we talked about, you can see why marriage is perpetually under attack in a wicked and depraved and rebellious world. So I want to close with this. We have a few minutes left here. Hebrews 13:4 says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." I want to look at that phrase here. He says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all." And so what are some things that Christians and churches can do to honor marriage? That's why I want to throw that as our final question for you. So,
I mean, there's a lot we can do for sure, but certainly, make a big deal about weddings. When a young couple is getting married, it doesn't have to be a young couple. When a couple in the church is getting married, we celebrate that as a whole church. Recognize that. Celebrate anniversaries. So the great thing about being part of a church family, church community, is you're with others, often people who are very different than you. So for a young couple that's been married for 5 years, they'll be in a church with an older couple that's been married for 50 years, 60 years even. And for the church to recognize that and to celebrate that type of lifelong commitment. And it's just neat to watch, people who've been married for that long and the way they interact with one another. They're so used to one another. Talk about complementation. They just know how the other person thinks. Certainly preaching on it and teaching about marriage as well. I think there's a lot we can do to recognize marriages, and especially those that long persevering marriages. That's why I would encourage someone who's younger and newly married, look to the wisdom of those who have been married for a long time. And just say, hey, what's your secret? How did you make this work? And just watch how they've made it work.
That's a good word.
One thing I observe in our church is that as now families don't often live near each other. We don't often have the grandparents living nearby, and my wife and I don't live near our parents.
Yeah.
But I enjoy, as a pastor, getting to interact and get close with some of the elderly couples that have been married for 50 years or more, and seeing how beautiful that is. And one area that we could grow is somehow helping. I mean, I get to connect with the older couples because I'm the pastor, but I don't often see younger couples connecting with older couples, and I'd like to see that more. So that's just one idea. Another thing is we need to prioritize prayer for couples, prayer for our culture in this regard, which is moving away from a biblical understanding of sexuality and marriage. And one final thing is, I'd say I think we can expect to see a lot more refugees and survivors from our sexually broken culture.
Yeah.
And we want to be a place that not only upholds what the Bible upholds, but also have our doors open, our arms open for the refugees and the survivors. That this is a safe place, and we're all survivors in certain ways. We all have sexual brokenness in our past and even in our present.
Yeah.
And just along with that too, Dave, it's seeing marriages restored. And you'll see that in a church where the marriage was falling apart and it wasn't going to work, and yet one of them, starts praying, starts coming to church, starts, praying for their spouse, and then maybe, let's say it's the wife coming, he starts coming, and then maybe they want to sit down and they meet, and then all of a sudden, maybe there's been some great betrayal, great hurt, great sin, and yet God does something special and restores that relationship, and then, they live out the rest of their lives in enjoying that marriage. So seeing the miracle, really, of God's grace and transforming grace.
Yeah, that's great. That's great words. And there's nothing that we can do about marriage in the culture. It is what it is. It's going this way. It's going to continue that way. But we sure can do something about the culture within our churches, and establishing that. And in one sense, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to shine like stars in a dark world. And really, you see the difference between it. I recently gave a sermon and mentioned St. Valentine's and how he became this great saint and a martyr because of his devotion to marriage. At that point, I think it was illegal for Christians to marry. I think he was performing secret ceremonies, but he really held marriage in great esteem, and felt there was so much at stake with that. We have an opportunity in our churches and all Christians to really stand apart from the culture as we honor it. So, well, thank you for that. We're just about done, and thank you for your input, you guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you for watching. And hope you've enjoyed this discussion on our series of Crossroads, working through this progressive creed together and comparing and contrasting it to the scriptures as we do. So with that, let me thank our panel once again, and thank you for tuning in. May we all grow together in the grace and knowledge and especially the love of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. May God bless you, and we'll see you next time on Crossroads.